Welcome back to the Fundamentals of Object workshop. You've already learned all of the concepts that you'll need to know to create a simple timeline object, except for one. You could think of the process of creating a simple timeline object as identical to creating a single stack object, with the exception of the configuration panel. So in this lesson, we'll focus on how to configure simple timeline objects. Simple timelines take an object that contains either events or potentially overlapping intervals and creates a timeline object with non-overlapping intervals. As a reminder, events objects have observations that represent a single moment in time, like an object with observation outpatient office visits. Interval objects have observations that represent a period of time and have a start and end date, like an object capturing information about home health episodes of care. To clarify, let's think about an example of building a simple timeline from an interval object. Imagine you're working with membership data from a single plan that, due to some data processing reason, contains overlapping periods for the same members. For example, this membership period's data might improperly have records that imply the patient is in the same plan using two or more records, essentially having duplicate periods of time for a single patient for a single plan. To ensure the accuracy of the downstream analytics, you want to guarantee each member only has one record for a particular period of time. The simple timeline object allows you to take the data scenario we just described and create an object that ensures there are no overlapping periods of time for the same member of a plan. You can also create a simple timeline from an event object. For example, you could take an object with lab results and create a simple timeline with non-overlapping periods when the lab results are relevant. In this example, each lab represents an event. And let's say we want to create an object that takes the highest GFR result for each patient within a 1-year period as the result of record for that period. The simple timeline will then be able to answer the question, during this period of time, what was the patient's GFR lab value? I think you'll find that timeline theory is more involved than actually creating a timeline object. As I mentioned, after the last course on single stack objects, you're familiar with the core functionality of Object Workshop. As we've discussed, simple timelines can either bring in a single event object or a single potentially overlapping interval. Here, you'll see I've added our event object, NOTRN patient assessment. Once an event is selected, the options to add a potentially overlapping interval option is deactivated, and vice versa. However, you can link objects to the base event or interval object. As I mentioned, the only deviation from what you learned in the single stack course is how to configure the configuration panel. This is where the parameters that define the timeline are entered. Let's go ahead and set up each of these parameters now for an event-based simple timeline. But we will cover an interval-based simple timelines configuration as well. The first field, Entity ID, is often a patient for which the non-overlappingness of the periods is going to be enforced. Said another way, two different patients can be members of the same plan on the same date, and that does not create a conflict. The platform knows this is not a conflict because the entity field specifies the basis for reconciling these overlapping periods. That is, the platform only considers periods to be overlapping when the overlappingness occurs for the same entity. In the simple patient timeline object we're creating, we will select the patient ID for the entity ID. For event-based simple timelines, like the one we're creating, there are 3 fields that need to be completed when configuring the object: event date duration, and event effect unit. The event date field captures which date field from the event object to use in creation of the timeline. In this example, that would be the assessment date. The event effect duration defines the maximum look-back period for these events. Here you can identify an arbitrary length of time during which the event would still be relevant. For example, I'll set the duration to be 6 months, so if my most recent event was on January 1st, and now it's November, that event will no longer be relevant. I'll enter 6 here to begin specifying the 6-month look-back period. The event effect unit is where you'll specify whether the event effect duration should be considered in terms of days, weeks, months, or years. The simple timeline object generates a new set of fields, and the next several fields allow you to specify the label, column, and fields groups for the period's start and end dates. The labels and columns are auto-generated. The default label is typically a sensible choice, so you may not need to make any changes here. However, if needed, you can override the default value in the period's start date label field simply by typing into the text box, which will auto-update the value in the period start date column field. As you would expect, this field allows you to specify which field group you want the period start date field to belong to. Here, we'll use the date fields group. You can now repeat the process you just completed for the end date fields label, column, and field group. Lastly, duplicate resolution ranking enables you to specify how you would like duplicate events or intervals to be handled. In our example, if 2 assessments are reported on the same date without a timestamp, this allows a ranking that will identify the most relevant of those potentially multiple events on the same day, or multiple overlapping intervals with the same start date. For this timeline, we are specifying that we want to keep the highest GFR result, so we'll select the patient GFR in descending order. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, let's take a look at a simple timeline object that was built using an interval base object. The difference in configuration is subtle, but I'm going to quickly point it out to you nonetheless. The object we're reviewing creates a simple timeline using health plan membership periods. The only difference between configuring an event-based simple timeline and an interval-based simple timeline concerns how the stack-based object's dates are specified. For an interval-based simple timeline, you need to specify the period start date and period end date fields. Whereas for an event-based simple timeline, as you saw, you only need to specify the event date field. Other than that, all of the configuration options are the same. So that's it for this lesson. You already know how to configure the other object property panels, so you're all set to start creating simple timeline objects. Thanks for taking a moment to review this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.